Hey guys, it's Michael Valdes. How are you? Come back to our Real Estate Mastery podcast. My background looks a little different. I'm actually in Mexico giving a speech today. And I wanted to keep the consistency of this podcast. And today was an incredibly special guest. And this is going to be, I already know, an incredible conversation. So I have the one and only Rene Rodriguez, who is one of the foremost speakers in the space of personal development. I had the great joy of spending time with Rene last week, and I cannot wait for this conversation. Rene Rodriguez, brother, come on in.
Hey, it's great to be here, my friend.
Oh my goodness. So I got to tell you, so last week, Rene and I spent time together at an event where Rene was one of the keynotes in New York. And we had a private dinner that the host had set up. And Rene and I figured out that we both had Cuban origin. And for those of you that don't know, the moment that happened, Rene is now my brother, literally. And so it was an incredible, incredible connection. Rene, I'm so glad you're here. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday to you, man. And it is that inexplicable connection that I think is it's fun to meet. It's rare to meet, and I think that we can probably draw some cool connections between how we build a business that way with great connections.
It's so true. Well, that's a lot of what you do, right? Connecting with people, teaching people how to connect with people. And we're going to dissect all of that. But before we get there, one of the greatest things that I was sitting there mesmerized with you. And in fact, remember somebody came up and sort of said, this has to be the most intense conversation I've seen with two people. But one of the stories you were telling me was about your mom. And I want you to share that story because I've actually not heard you share that story a lot and the interviews that you've done in the past. And this is what I think builds the story for actually what you do and where you dedicated your life. So
Yeah.
Tell me about your mom.
So my mother was born in Cuba and lived in Cuba before and after the Cuban Revolution. So she got a chance to watch a culturally Catholic country turn communist in 6 months. And we talk about change, we talk about revolution. I mean, that happened. And we all so many different experiences around the Cuban revolution and what happened, and so much sadness around people losing everything they had built and families being torn apart and all those things. But she was there and left and went to Germany as her father, my grandfather, was part of the American Armed Forces. In fact, his way out of Cuba was writing a letter to the president of the United States saying, if you can get me and my family out of this country, I'll come and fight for yours. And so I pulled him out. And so my mother and her sister went on a world tour, Germany, right after the Holocaust. She was at one point in Panama during the Panama Canal crisis, was in Vegas during the A-bomb testing. Then she decided to become a nun and was a nun on the border of Haiti. And here she was, 5 different countries, all before the age of 25. All of them had something to do with war, revolution, change. And imagine how that affects somebody growing up and how they see the world. And so her vision of life and her goal of life was global peace and community. And when she realized that being a nun, thank God she realized this for my sake, that wasn't the way that she was going to achieve it, she left after 8 years and started working with migrant labor in Southern Florida. And when you work with migrant labor, it's basically a slave labor with no chains. And it's people in some way, shape, or form opting into this environment. And so when you look at that, and she believed it wasn't a conscious opting in, it was a feeling of learned helplessness and a feeling of that, you realize that maybe you don't have another choice. And so her mission became, how do you free them and help them free themselves from this? And that created an approach where it isn't theoretical, and it wasn't here's a quick tip for social media. It was, here's an idea, let me try it on a group. It worked, cool, let's do it again. It didn't work, what do we do differently? And over the years, sort of cultivating this process of what real change actually is. And I mean, there's so many stories that go with that, but of course, when you're dealing with and empowering migrant labor in Southern Florida, there's a certain group that didn't like that, and that was the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And so, one of the ways that she would build community was through music. There was no budgets in those areas, so she couldn't, bring money in and investment and the energy was low. There was usually drug and alcohol abuse, massive depression, very what we call learned helplessness, and I can talk about that from a psychology standpoint. And didn't matter if you had a great idea, if people were in that low energy state, that low frequency, low vibration, which we've all been. Some of us have friends that way. Realized it didn't work, and so she realized that her first step was to raise the level of energy, and she found that music, song, dance, the arts were the instant movement out of that area. And she would bring in these street musicians. I'll provide a picture that you can put on here that called Los Callejeros, which means the streets, like people from the streets. And they played the congas and the flute and maracas. And me as a kid, pair of maracas and a clown face. And I just would play music. And the moment they hear the music, they would just look up, and all of a sudden a little smile would kick in, and all of a sudden you'd realize that this person that was just flinched in a corner was a dancer. He'd be dancing. She was a singer. She'd sing. There was a percussionist over there. There was a painter. There was a magician. And all of a sudden, all of this energy just woke up this community, and it didn't cost anything. And so there's so many lessons from business that we pulled from that. But the certain group that didn't like her, and this is, I'm sure do you want me to show that?
I would love for you to show
that item. And so I have there was that group, the KKK didn't like it. So they realized that this was very powerful. So they had to stop her, and they used exactly what they always try to do, which is, bullying people, scaring people, fear. And they went after the core of who she was, which was her guitar. So they broke into her car, and they stabbed her guitar 17 times and filled it with water. And so you can see kind of a picture. I'll try to step back. I'll put it close so you can see. If you're watching the video of this, you can see a lot of the stab wounds, and they tried to break it and all sorts of stuff. So you can see this other side. But yeah, it was this has stayed with me since the 80s, and it's one of those remembrances of the the realities of the world where people don't agree, and especially in a cancel culture today, where you can stab people's heart online right now. We have to teach people that, one, that's not real. We can move forward through it. She had that physical reality, but she still did it. And so there's so many things that we can go and explore about that. But yeah, that's the general story. And I get a chance to sort of live her legacy.
So basically the interview is over now. That's extraordinary. It was, my God, this is an HBO series about your mom. The fact that all of that happened before she was 25, there was something you just said that was real. Well, there was a ton of things you said that was powerful, but one of the things that really resonated was the fact that they were slave labor with no chains. And there's so many things that we ourselves feel enslaved with in things that we do every single day.
Yeah.
With no physical chains. And this is where you dedicated your entire life to. Now, here's something that is so interesting to me. You're one of the top speakers in the space of personal development. And when you start thinking about this, you're the only one that truly breaks it down as a science. And I want to get into this. And so you talk about behavioral neuroscience. That's a huge sort of concept. I want you to simplify that for the audience. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And so think about it this way. And the first lesson came from my mother again, where 30 years ago, she said, Rene, look at this room, and what does everybody have in common? And I'm looking around the room. I didn't understand. Like I was looking at skin color and culture and what they were dressed, tall, short, fat, skinny. And she said, no, they all have a brain. And if you can understand how people's brains work, life becomes easier. And so it took that in. And so I went to school for psychology because I had a really cool psychology teacher in high school. And then I realized that it wasn't just psychology, which was fascinating. I wanted to understand the neuroscience of the brain. And I really wanted to understand the brain and how it worked. And you realize that a lot of psychology and neuroscience is really more statistics. So it creates a very logical side of your thinking. But I didn't lose sight of what I had the more passion around was the applied side. So there's researchers that get their journals written. They're very smart, smarter than me. But then there's people like me that are forever curious, saying, okay, great study. What does it mean to me here? What does it mean to selling? Because I was selling cookware door to door. And so I'm like, okay, how's it going to help me close another deal? How's it going to help me present and get a 2%, conversion rate increase? Even 1%, I'll take 1. And, if I can get 10, that's career changing. If I can, completely shift, that's awesome. And you start realizing that there's certain circuitry in the brain that functions in a sequence. There's certain hierarchy in the brain that has to prioritize certain activities and certain attention things over others. And so here we are in this world that is so distracted. and realizing that our brain thinks in a certain pattern, and if we can learn to speak within that pattern, I'll work with the human brain versus working against it. And so, something as simple as human connection first. And so if you look at even the talk I gave at Gold Bar, I had people stand up and shake hands first. And it wasn't about knowledge, it wasn't about content, it was about connection. And if you can connect with the audience around you first, not even with the speaker, then you can do that. And if some people notice that before I spoke, because I was the opening speaker, I walked around and I shook the whole front row, not just around the first 5 rows. I shook all their hands and it spent about 30 minutes just kind of engaging with them as they were going there. And I even went to the back and took some pictures, and some knew who I was, most didn't, and which is very normal. But then it was really cool where somebody were like, "Oh, hi, thanks," and then they would say, "Oh, there's that guy that just shook my hand. Oh my god, I know him." And that oh my god, I know him. And when I do that to an audience, and then I come on stage, it's not my first time meeting my audience; it's my second. And if I hang around afterwards, it's my third.
Yeah.
And this is where a lot of speakers, I think, get it wrong, where they rip and dip. They come in, speak, and they leave. Now that does a lot for credibility and scarcity,
Mm.
which I totally understand the business reason for that. I had to make a really tough choice. Did I want that feeling of scarcity, or did I want the feeling of connection? And for me, at that point, it's simple. 30 years of connection, I think, builds not only a sense of community with people that you meet, but it builds a deeper connection and something that I think is even more valuable than scarcity, which is a sense of loyalty. And so there's a really cool foundation I think that we can create through that process. But yeah, the neuroscience to me, there's language sequences we can go into. I can give you. I mean, I hope people walk away with some stuff today, but we can give you some real simple things we can do just based on what we know.
Well, let's talk about that. I because I love this, and I love what you were talking about, and I love the fact that yes, you do now create a deeper sense of connection. Anyone who does know you talks about you in a way that elevates your brand, if you will,
Mm.
and who you are because of the way that you make them feel and the way that you've touched them. Even look, even us walking away from a conversation was like, this is one of the greatest people I've ever met,
Oh
right?
man.
And it's sort of like, and there's this bond now, which is a forever bond, right? Because of who you are and what you did. And so now let's talk about leadership, right? I mean, you have trained thousands and thousands of people, but you also have trained some of the greatest leaders in industry, in business. What is the commonality that you see there? And the second part to that is, how do you elevate that second tier to go up to that tier?
That's a great question. What's interesting is that it kind of depends on industry,
Yeah.
and there's a certain maturity level on certain industries, and that maturity level is truly defined by margin. And I'll explain by that. So you get into manufacturing, and they're fighting for pennies of margin. You get into, you can't put a car door on more than once in the auto industry. It has to go on the first time exactly right every single time. You can't put it on and have somebody else check to see if you put it on correctly. It has to go on. And if not, that car, if you get a half a percentage point loss in quality or in cost, in margin, excuse me, the car's no good, the company goes bankrupt.
Right.
And so they're thinking very differently. They're thinking quality. They're thinking about retention. They're thinking about how do I treat people so they treat our customers well. They're thinking about a growth plan and bench strength and career paths. They're thinking about creating community and culture, knowing and understanding the importance of communication. They're not thinking revenue because they
Mm.
already have that. Right. They've got that. They understand the market is divided from a certain market share, and there's only X amount of this available. We position ourselves to get this, and this is what we can count on, and we just have to manufacture to that number. Then you get into places that have massive volume, and excuse me, massive margins. And our audience is not going to like what I'm going to say, but mortgage and real estate is one of those audiences. And so, very rarely do you think and you hear companies talk about culture, talk about communication. They say those words, but really they're making decisions based on, is this going to get me my next deal?
Mm.
And now, one of the things I love about EXP is you and Leo and all the leadership team, that you guys have truly created a model and a culture where if you're in a group of EXP people, you know where you're at. There's a sense of energy there. There's a sense of community. But let's talk about the broker level. Are they thinking from a community and culture's perspective, or are they thinking, how do I get that next deal? Is a real estate agent thinking about culture and connection, or are they thinking about where do I get my next one? Now, what you'll find is the top performers do think that way. So
Mm,
when revenue's sort of handled, they start thinking of there's new levels of complexity that follow them. And I get it. When you're new at this, you better think revenue and sales. That's exactly where you should be.
that's right.
Once
Yeah.
you've kind of figured that out, now you've got a different challenge of marketing this expertise to a wider audience. It's the only way that you grow. So think sales and marketing, or the baseline would be sort of your essential knowledge of understanding how the things work. Then you got to think about, how do I sell this essential knowledge to make money? That's when you make more than 100 grand. You want to make 250, you better start thinking marketing. And because now it's in marketing, it's this sales message out to the masses. And once you've done that well, now you got a problem. You got a scaling problem. So you got to think teamwork. And so now you got a teamwork and being a leader problem. And now you've got teamwork. You figured that out. Now you're going to think, okay, how do I manage this money? And now I've got to think money and mouth, and then think about, being a true leader of leaving the legacy, which is the top tier. And so this is maturity level of leadership that sort of follows as your income revenue grows and also really harnessed in by the margins within the industry.
I actually love that breakdown of the tiers. Never quite heard it that way. So it really is a simplistic bucket that you put it into. So here's something, and it's almost in that middle ground of, that marketing and branding, right? And then one of the things that I thought was so fascinating is what you talk about of telling your story. You say that everyone has a story to tell. And tell me that the idea of anyone listening has a story. How do you get them to figure out A, what their story is, and then B, how to tell it effectively?
And the truth, I mean, we all have a story because we're all here, right? So the story is a, beginning, a middle, and an end that
Yeah,
happens in multiple cycles. And so, like there's a story this morning of us getting on, this call. And if I can chunkate that story of, the beginning was when we met at dinner at
yeah,
Charlie Palmer's, and then we had the text message we talked this morning, and now we're here doing this. So there's a little story there.
yeah.
But there's a story of like my mother, what she did. There's your story growing up. And there's the story of how each one of you listening has a journey to get to exactly where you're at. Now, where you're at is where you're at. It's no judgment involved. It's not a good, bad, ugly. It's not better or worse. It's just where you're at. And when you realize, so I can tell that story. Some people, you'll find people that say, I really, really have a good story to tell. And then some people be like, I don't have any story to tell. I've worked with well over 200,000 people, and everyone has a story. And there's never any need for comparison on that story,
There you go.
because with the story, it's like comparing fingerprints. Like, why? Like, well, which mine's better? It's just, no, this one's mine. This one's yours. And the more that I understand yours, the more I understand you. There's where the connection comes into play. But story plays a much bigger role. Because I'll tell you that everybody has a story, but let me tell you about the role that it plays and why. Because, like, who cares? I have a story to tell. In fact, I tell people nobody cares about your story.
Mhm.
And it's kind of depicted in this concept. We know the difference between somebody who's a really good storyteller and someone who loves to tell stories.
There you go.
And there's a big difference between those two, but it's only one thing. And this is the deeper understanding, is that a good storyteller uses a story, whether it's their own personal story, something that happened previously, somebody else's, a third person story, whatever it is, to open up their audience to be receptive to an idea.
Mm,
And if I can then deliver that idea at the end, you go, wow, that time spent listening to that story was so worth it, because I'll remember this idea. I'll remember this form of value. If you remove that final piece, all that happened is that you used my time just to tell me a story. And
oof.
when that happens,
Yeah.
at the end of that time invested, people are like, and why did I just sit through all that? And there's this piece. And so people that love to tell stories, they do it more for themselves, assuming
Mhm.
that people are going to get some value out of it. But somebody who's a really good storyteller uses a story as much as necessary, but as little as possible of that story to deliver a message of value. And then you feel like it was a gift. And so the story was the means by which to achieve value.
Wow. That's such an incredible distinction. Incredible, because it also is the perspective. How did it land? Did you do it for yourself or did
Mm,
you do it for someone else?
yeah. And if you do it for someone else, there's no ego in it.
That's right.
It's because it's literally, then you know when to stop telling the story. Like
Yeah.
there's so many stories that you could share, but what am I trying to achieve with this? And it's a big distinction, hard one to get, but then the really good ones, they get it.
So following up on that, that basically is a definition of influence, right? And one of the things that you say often is that influence is a science. Now that fascinated me, that statement. So explain that. You can teach influence?
100%. It's, and I have a video that's on Vimeo. I haven't released it yet, but people would challenge me, Rene, you're natural, you're natural. I'm like, really? That's like telling a virtuoso on a piano that they're natural. All the 10 hours a day that they did for 18 years, totally natural. And like, yep, they're lucky. No, it's every story. Every one of us have gotten good at something. We're new at first at one point. So I went back and I found my first video training.
Mm.
Boy, was that painful. Um, uh, um, what was that thing that that was me.
Yeah.
And I was in my 20s. And that was like mid 20s. And realizing that I'm sitting here trying to follow my mother, who was this most amazing speaker I've ever met, and I'm up there. I don't have a story. The KKK didn't bother me. I mean, they did when I was a kid, but I wasn't old enough really to really remember. I remember they used to shoot at our house. I remember those things, but it was like, it wasn't something that was truly defining, because at that age, you're just like, okay, that's just what happens. And you really think nothing of it. And partially because my parents didn't, or my dad wasn't around, didn't put a narrative around it, meaning she didn't make it traumatic. We didn't have any conversations around trauma. It was just what happened, and we move forward and we protect ourselves, and then the day goes on. But the reality of all of that comes down to understanding that we all started somewhere. And when we don't see that journey, we start to really, really diminish the hard work that goes into creating that. And so all of us have that ability. And so influence truly is about understanding that journey and being able to, one, to capture someone's attention. Because if I can't capture your attention, how good is the idea? Think of how many good agents that
Yep.
that no one knows about. The
Yep.
good-hearted people, the ones that truly have the market knowledge, that truly care about their customers, man, but they just haven't learned how to close, and they haven't learned their social media, they haven't learned how to market. And we're just like, can you please, we need you out there. And so that's who I'm talking to. If you haven't captured attention, no one knows you exist, especially in today's world. And then how do I get you to act on that? So one thing to tell, that's why the story isn't the influence. The story is the means by which you then get to influence them. And if you have nothing to offer at the end of that, nothing's moved. It's like, basically, would you plant a seed in cement? You wouldn't, because it wouldn't grow. Well, that's an idea planted without story first. It just doesn't grow. And you know what's interesting? If I can divert from it, I explained this concept on 3 days ago on social media. Now this post went viral, almost, so it's over 500,000 views. It's
Wow.
going to get to 1 million. And but the majority, now it's about 8,000 likes. So there's people that like it, but there's the majority of those comments that were, I was talking about framing, and I was doing an elementary introduction to the framing about what's your favorite color, and people saying, you'd say blue or red. And I said, okay, well, let me show you what framing means. And then somebody says, what's your favorite color? And I said, I was born in Miami, moved to Minnesota when I was 7 years old, lived Miami, Minnesota half time till I was about 17, 18 years old. So I never felt at home. But if I ever saw on a beach and I saw palm trees, I knew I was close to my friends, my food, my music, my culture, all the things that made me happy. So palm trees are green, so my favorite color is green.
Hmm.
And so it was just a way of illustrating in a training environment what framing can do to a message. How I can take a stupid question like, what's your favorite color? And I can tell you a lot about myself to connect with you in that. And all the comments are, bro, just give me the message. This is a 5th degree yapper black belt. There's like all these crazy comments about, I would have walked away. I fell asleep. I did this all. And that's what's fascinating, is the most common objection I get to those that have never been in a position that need to influence. They've never been in a position, or maybe been frustrated in blaming other people for them not listening, versus learning how to speak in a way that people actually do that. Now, was I suggesting that you frame up favorite color all the time? No. That's like saying you have a driver, use it for every shot on golf. No, assess the situation and then pick your tool. Framing is one of those tools that you choose, but you have to learn how to assess. But what's fascinating to your whole point, that is the biggest common objection that I get to this, is saying not everything needs a frame. I'm like, well, frames are how we construct reality. And if
Yeah.
I don't offer a frame to you, you're going to choose your own, which probably doesn't coincide with the meaning of what I was intending. So I better frame this message first before you do incorrectly.
In fact, you wrote a book about it, Amplify Your Influence. Tell us about your book. You mentioned about framing. I know that's one of the chapters in your book. What's other highlights of this when you start thinking about the idea of influence as a science?
So yeah, the framing is such a deep concept that, and it's so um unconscious to people because we just accept reality as reality. But there's a
Yeah.
way that reality is constructed, and we have to. Like when I walked off stage, to kind of build a joke, and everybody kind of froze for a minute. I was in the middle of the talk and I walked off. People were like, "What happened? What happened?" And the reason stress went up is because there was a narrative that was happening, the story, and there was no frame around what I just did, which means there was a gap in that narrative. And since we
Mhm.
use narrative and framing to construct reality, that in essence creates a gap in reality, which we cannot handle. So the brain is trained to instantly fill that gap with past experiences based, and so it makes an assumption of what is most likely going to be the case. And so if we think about how many gaps are happening in our narrative of the world, and how many times I don't see somebody, so there's no way we can just fill all the gaps. And so our brain has to make these assumptions very quickly, right? And it's constantly doing that. And so what happens though is that it's often wrong, very often wrong. And so when we think about that whole piece of leadership truly is about managing and being the trusted source of that narrative gap. So if I don't know what's happening in the market, and I go to Michael, I go, what's happening? And you would be a trusted source
Mhm.
of saying, okay, well, Michael says this, I think we're good. But somebody that's just coming off the street, it doesn't even own a home, barely has any net worth to their name. Not saying that net worth is everything, but it is one measure of making some smart decisions. And if they really have just been a complainer, that they're not a trusted source for me. I'm
Right.
really not going to take a complainer's point of view on what's happening in the marketplace. If you become somebody who's engaged in fraud, or you've done something that's been illegal and you come and tell me that, I'm probably not going to trust you.
Mhm.
But if you're somebody that carries themselves with confidence, you've got a track record of success, you're articulate, you're empathetic, and you listen, just more likely that it's going to happen. And so the science is really understanding what's the science of trust? What is the science of communicating in a way that people will listen to you? And so all of those pieces we cover in the book, from storytelling to the construction of a talk, to body language, sequencing, timing. There's so many elements that go into it, but it's the underlying piece too is very philosophical, because if you think about a life with no influence, imagine walking in a room and no one noticing, telling
Right.
a joke and no one laughing, sharing an idea and no one caring, selling a product and no one buying, casting a vision and no one following. It is one of the worst of human experiences to feel that invisible and that insignificant. And so then you bring influence back. I walk in a room, people take notice. I tell a joke, people laugh. I sell a product, people buy. I share an idea, people love it. I cast a vision and I watch people mobilize and take action. That's one of the greatest experiences that we could have. Why? Because, well, without influence, any of those scenarios, if I'm in a meeting and I feel insignificant, I'd be like, why am I in this meeting? If I'm in a relationship feeling insignificant, I go, why am I in this relationship? People feel that way about life. Why am I here? I don't see any significance to what I'm doing. That's a sad place. But if I know why I'm here, meaning I do this and I watch that happen and I feel significant, I feel visible, I know why I'm here. So really we just answer that question of purpose
I
through
love.
influence.
Oh my God, I love that because that is the essence of it. When you actually start walking through it blindly, you don't recognize it. When you become cognizant of it and break it down literally as a science, as you've done, that makes us face it. And
Yeah.
not only face it, it makes us correct behavior to be
Yes.
able to actually get to where we want to be.
Yep. I agree.
You also talk about value a lot. Define value.
Mhm. So let's put it in two places. There's relationship value and there's business value. Sometimes both together is exponential. But there's relationship value, meaning there's the intangible value of a relationship. Somebody listens, they're there for me, I can depend on them. There's loyalty, there's trust, and their family. That's a value in and of itself. The hardest part for people to understand is that doesn't always equate into business. And a business is a for-profit entity. Now, the means by which you get to for-profit should embrace the value of humans, right? Because we're doing business as humans.
Of course.
But there's no platform. The business doesn't have a platform without profitability. And so it's somebody that says, well, people over profits. I hear that. But what if there's no profits? That means that there's no jobs. And if there's no jobs, the people have to go elsewhere. And that's not about saying I just value money over people. I'm saying, hey, let's all come together and identify that we do need to create a profitable business so that we can play in this area together to help people. And
Mhm.
so that's a mind shift that needs to happen. And when people just embrace that, it's not about choosing. There's a sequence to it so that I can get to this. What life? It's about enjoying life. Well, sometimes I have to not enjoy life so that I can enjoy life. I have to not eat all the bad foods and not smoke and not drink, which might be enjoyable in that moment, so that I can enjoy my family and my kids and the things that really matter.
Right.
And so that whole piece around um, what that means and how we get to that really is what determines value. Now, if you get into a manufacturing site, you get into a business, value is determined very simply in only one way, on one way and only. Will the customer pay for it?
That's right.
Period.
Yeah.
And if they don't, it's not valuable. Now, when you get into manufacturing and you get into lean, Six Sigma, and the quality sciences, the first step in that process is to identify customer value. And then you assess the entire value stream. Every step that's taken in the process in sales would be from lead to close and afterwards, before, during, and after the transaction. That's the value stream. Manufacturing would be from the supply chain in essence, and how we get that all the way to the customer. And you assess every step in that process with one question: does this add value to the customer? And then you'll get one of three answers. Well, first, it's either a yes or a no. Yes,
Mhm.
you keep it. No, then you have two more questions to answer. Is it necessary? Because they call it waste. Muda. It's Japanese for waste. And if it doesn't add value, that means it's muda. And so then the Japanese say, okay, so is it type 1 or type 2? Meaning, is it needed for the customer, type 1? And you keep it. It's just, we got to make that really efficient as little as possible. And if it's not needed and it does not add customer or value, they cut it. And all of a sudden you start getting, well, that's the true streamlining process. Value, will the customer pay for it? Type 1 or type 2, and then we start getting, but this is a PhD sort of science approach to it, but it gives you a really clear sense of what value means. And the other piece too is what Jim Rohn used to say is that we don't get paid for the hour, we get paid for the value we bring to the hour.
That's right.
And what's the difference between somebody who gets $10 an hour versus somebody who's making 600 million? There's only one difference: the value they bring to the marketplace. Because you're not paid for the hour. You're not paid because if you were paid for time, then you could just show up and get paid. But you're paid for what the market determines that you're causing during that time. And the market is also known as reality. Your industry knows this better. Imagine a customer saying, "Oh, I want 500,000," but market data says it's worth 300. Well, sell it. I don't care what you say. The market determines this value. Now, I have a slight role in my presentation ability, my ability to build trust, and my ability to get it out to more people, and my marketing to be able to sort of influence that value a little bit. But I can create this facade of value, but at the end of the day, there is this comparable thing of, where on this house, why did I spend $200,000 more than I should have?
Mhm.
And so we have to embrace reality in that sense as well. But then you go even deeper, you bring relationship value to the business table. Now, all of a sudden, we're really able to play. People will say no to a lower price to say yes to you because you're into something together. And that is really, really cool.
Oh, I love that. And it's also the other component of value. And I love what you actually did at your speech at Gold Bar, where you used the example of the chicken. Right? It's sort of like you could be a $1 nugget at a fast food restaurant, or you could be a $150 plate under a glass dome, and
Yeah.
you'll gladly pay that, but it's the same chicken.
Yeah. A piece of chicken with no story ends up on a dollar menu at KFC. Yeah.
Love that.
And a piece of chicken with a story, we'll eat it off a tasting menu and we don't look at the price. And it's just the story. And if you look at, everybody listening, there is no patent monopolies in real estate. There are
No.
none. And there's no true differentiators. Any technology we could replicate if we wanted to. And the truest definition of all of that is really hard to replicate. And so what's your differentiator? It's your story. Meaning, what is the experience around working with you? What is it like? It's now, when I say your story, I'm talking a lot more than, well, I was born in Florida. That's not what I mean. If that story is of value to the customer, then it is part of the story. But the story might be, when you work with us, you will feel taken care of. You will feel uh, you will feel valued, and you will feel like you are making the right decision because we know what we're talking about. There's a potential story. Well, prove that to us. How'd you learn that? Now tell us a story about how you were able to achieve all that. And that's part of it. Well, part of your story, I saw you on TV hosting that home, and I just think, man, that just built a lot of credibility. So there's part of your story. So there's so many aspects to approach it from.
Yeah, I love that. Tell the viewers about your podcast. I love your podcast too.
Thank you. Well, I've got podcast is it's fine. You can get it on our website, meetrene.com. I just realized I have it twice on my thing. I should probably switch that. Um, but yeah, it's on meetrene.com. You click on it. It originally started when I was writing the book. I would write a chapter and then do a podcast about it, and then write a chapter and do a podcast, and write a chapter and do a podcast. And it was just me talking to the camera.
Yeah.
And then the second season, I started inviting people. In fact, let's have you on mine. That would be a fun conversation. Let's just book that for sure. But I'm dead serious. Let's do that. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
And so I started interviewing people for season 2. You know, people like Hal Elrod, and we had Ryan LeVarn Way. He's got a World Series pin. We've got who else do we got on there? Neil Ford, who's one of the top 10 most decorated creative directors in the world. We got some really, really cool people that, so there's that. And so really trying to understand, you know, the aspects of influence that these people have had, you know, through their story. My job is I try to draw out the essence of the replicable, applicable nuggets that come out of there. I'm very big on, I think story is really cool, and history is really cool, but I want to know, what can I do with that lesson? And that's sort of the role I play on the podcast.
Love that. Now, final question, which I ask all of my guests, and of course I didn't sort of give it to you beforehand because I love the impromptu of it.
Let's bring it.
In your book of life, what is this chapter called and why?
Damn, that's a good question.
Isn't it good?
Yeah. Because I love thinking of life as a book, and every year you write a book, and your whole life is a book. If this chapter was it, and I'm trying to find the word, but I'm feeling like this is the word that keeps coming to mind, a sense of awakening.
Ooh.
There's a sense of because I feel like I'm just getting started. I'm 30 years into this game, but for some reason I feel like I'm brand new, and I feel like I'm like, okay, oh, this is how this works. And there's this awakening that's happening where I'm being called into something bigger. And so my mother used to always use the term call to power. So let's go with that. A call to power.
Ooh, that's powerful. Well, I want to end right there with that call to power. Rene, my brother, what an amazing, amazing time with you. It really is extraordinary. For those that don't know you, it's meetrene.com. This man is an incredible human being, has touched the lives of so many people, including mine. And I love spending time with you, my brother.
Oh man, the honor, the pleasure is mine, man. You're doing such great things. I'm excited to just to engage more, and I hope everybody got a lot. Make sure you follow. It's Learn with Rene. I was going to try to shift that, but
Learn with Rene. Sorry,
yeah.
There it is.
No, but meetrene.com is the website, but you can follow me on Instagram on Learn with Rene.
There you go. All right, my brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend.
See you very soon.